Okay, so now we are reading through the Annals of Iowa. This is a continuation of the Civil War because I wanted to look up about Rock Island. Annals of Iowa, established 1863, West Des Moines, October 1958, third series, number 6. Davenport and the Civil War by Ted Hinckley. The Civil War is often referred to as America's first modern war. Proof of this is the record breaking number of lives expended, the prodigious consumption of material resources, and the wide geographic extent of the actual fighting zones. Now, when I was a kid, I have to add this in. We weren't taught about this part. We were not taught about this related to Rock Island being part of the Civil War because we were just taught that it was just in the South. Every northern and southern community contributed to the struggle in some manner. Most of them gave their flesh and blood. Some became one vast factory or granary. A few served as logistical nerve centers. The region immediately surrounding Davenport, Iowa, presents an interesting and curious example of the military duties performed by one northern Mississippi River community in the years from 1861 to 1865. And so even this date on the top here is 1863, 100 years before 1963, which was civil unrest during the 1963s. When the firing of Fort Sumter announced the separation of the Southern Sisters, I don't know what that is. That's interesting, though. The western river town of Davenport was a population center of about 15,000 people. Well, right now, I think Davenport is closer to 100,000 now. Directly across from it, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, was the railroad entreport of Rock Island. Just 4 years before, these two cities had been joined by the first bridge to span the nation's greatest river. This erection of the pine and oak truss-type structure had been facilitated by the Mississippi island known as Rock Island, federally owned, and the site of Old Armstrong, 1816 to 1836. The island lay across the river from Davenport and a few hundred feet from the Illinois bank. This 3 miles of insular real estate and the steamboat decorated levee of Davenport opposite it were to play a significant part, albeit relatively small, in the Civil War. On April 16, 1861, Iowa's Governor Samuel J. Kirkwood received a telegram from Secretary of War Cameron stating that a call had been made upon him for one regiment of militia for immediate service. The next day, proclamations were issued urging the citizenry to sustain the government and for each county militia to organize into companies. Iowans, like so many of their northern compadres in arms, were utterly unprepared to fight a shooting war. Governor Kirkwood was unable to find anyone in the capital city who even knew what number of volunteers would actually constitute a regiment. Only after a hurried trip to Davenport to consult the knowledgeable Judge John F. Dillon did he secure a definitive answer. In the pre-war years, national holidays had always produced colorful parades by such Hawkeye militia companies as the Blues, Guards, and Rifles. Essentially fraternal in purpose, these volunteer bodies had little military capability. Even worse, the state's ostensible arsenal of weapons was alarmingly short. Iowa, unlike other western states of that day, began the conflict without even a single unit of the regular army within its borders. Fortunately, the state's lack of physical preparedness was counterbalanced by the reassuring war spirit of the Hawkeyes. On June 8, 1861, Governor Kirkwood was able to write to the Secretary of War, "I am overrun with application of companies for admission into the national service. Our people are loyal, patriotic, and devoted." Their hearts are with you in this national struggle. Their prayers daily ascend for the president. The most immediate mobilization problem was one of turning farm boys into soldiers. To expedite the organization and training of these volunteer regiments, camps were established in or near most of Iowa's principal cities. Davenport fortunately possessed their dual advantages of eastern telegraph and railroad links. During the 1850s, the burgeoning river town had served as a market terminal for distribution of substantial quantities of foodstuffs. Iowa pork and vegetable crops had been regularly shipped south, even to such distant ports as Cuba and Mexico. After April of 61, that would be 1861, this extension of Mississippi commerce was shut off. The steamboat facilities, of course, remained and added to the attractiveness of the region as a potential troop rendezvous training embarkation center. An important recommendation, particularly in a rebellion, was strong Union sentiment manifested in and about Davenport. Of the approximate 30 volunteer companies existent in Iowa, an outbreak of hostilities, 4 had been active in Davenport. Hello, BC, and Posting Clone. Hello, Posting Clone and BC. For the above reasons, the vicinity became various times through the Civil War and the site of 5 military posts: Camp McClellan, Camp Roberts, later called Camp Kinsman, Camp Joel Hote, oh, that's interesting, Camp Huron, and Camp Hendershot. Oh, what a name, Camp Hendershot. You're posting, BC. Okay, you're posting. The last 3 named being in service only during 1861 to 1862. That's an interesting name, Camp Hendershot, right there. On August 8th, 1861, Newton D. Baker, Adjutant General of Iowa, after moving his office to Davenport, established Camp McClellan. It was the first of the city's 5 military cantonments and remained throughout the war as the foremost among them. On the scenic ground of Camp McClellan, situated on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, many a country lad began his martial transformation. The tenacity which he later displayed on the sanguinary bluffs above Pittsburgh Landing evidenced that the Davenport transformation had been surprisingly effective. By August 17th, the post boasted some 20 military buildings, among which were 13 barracks, horse stalls, a commissariat, a granary, a guard horse, and an officer's quarters. Many of these structures were so miserably erected that they had to be replaced in a few months. Oh, so the quarters didn't last very long. Despite this hasty construction, not all the volunteer influx could be housed on the campgrounds. Downtown, Davenport buildings such as the famous Burtis House and the railway depot were utilized as stopgap barracks. This was but one of many military elements which initially had to bow before necessity. William Strop Fultz of the 11th Iowa Infantry later recounted how, because of a sparsity of uniforms, citizens could pass in and out of Camp McClellan almost at liberty. No less unmilitary were the pine lath swords, which the soldiers were equipped for sentry duty. By the end of October, some of the 1,000 men were encamped at Camp McClellan, and the mobilization crisis had been surmounted. After being mustered in the 25th of that month, After being mustered on the 25th of that month, Hawkeye recruit Pete Wilson wrote to his father, "Our shanties are built tight as a good barn, bunked up like a ship, 2 in a bunk. We have plenty of straw, and we are very comfortable." Okay, so they were sleeping in a barn in hay. That was the military quarters back then. In a barn in hay. That's where they were sleeping. Think about that, guys. They were sleeping with the horses. Basically, that was their quarters for the military. Our fare consists of beef, bread, beans, potato, rice, and coffee. We get plenty to eat. and good enough. We are all satisfied with our camp arrangement. Homesickness and military regimentation annoyed not a few Davenport trainees. However, the good, rich soil of Iowa seemed to have to provide for most of the gastronomic wants. As must always be the case when large bodies of men are concentrated together, the twin problems of hard liquor and even harder women, what? Harder women, beset the 5 Davenport camps. Soldier White related to his father. There are many of the soldiers that won't be content to stay at home in the evening. They run the guard and go downtown on a spree. When there's a good many out, we sometimes have to go after them and have some fun bringing them back. Not all come back peaceably. Oh my goodness. Captain C. Barney of the 20th Iowa recollected. One of them, after figuring at principal in general fight on the levee and receiving a severe gash on the head from the fragment of an iron pot. Oh my goodness, I never knew that. Maybe that's where that story came from. Someone hit him on the head with an iron pot. Was finally captured and brought back to camp, lashed down on a dray. Not all the female parasites were successful in their forays against Camp McClellan. Now, what in the world does that mean? The female parasites? On one occasion, the Davenport Gazette reported, last evening several women of easy virtue who were trifling with the soldiers about, oh my God. Okay, let's start over and see if I can do that without laughing. On one occasion, the Davenport Gazette reported, last evening several women of easy virtue who were trifling with the soldiers about Camp McClellan Hospital were treated to a cold bath in the Mississippi by order of the officer in charge. So apparently, he told them to go jump in the river. As early as September 25th, 1861, the first Davenport-trained military body was boarded the river transport Jenny Whipple. Oh, Jenny Whipple! That name is familiar. I wonder why. Jenny Whipple. And headed down the river. That's kind of interesting. You think of Jenny Whipple? Jenny Whipple up there in Davenport, Iowa. And then in Savannah, you got Jenny, I don't know what her last name was. Jenny Gump. Jenny Forrest Gump. And then you got the Davenport house down there too. And headed down the river. That some of their sons had gone forth to war without arms. And many instances without comfortable clothing. Now, when they say without arms, does that mean that they brought disabled soldiers in? Or, I mean, they had no arms to do things with on their body? I'm confused. But some were almost barefooted. Some had only pants and a coat. Shamed many Scott County residents and caused the local Daily Democrat to emit a protesting blast. Oh, I kind of forgot that they are in Scott County, Iowa. Fortunately, the huge logistical buildup of the St. Louis remedied most of these soldiers' needs before they went into battle. Strenuous efforts had enabled the outpouring of the Hawkeye Manhood Reservoir to be properly channeled. By March 21st, 1862, Iowa had prepared for combat 16 infantry regiments, 4 cavalry regiments, and 4 batteries of artillery. That spring found Davenport's military training facilities adequate to meet all future troop mobilization contingencies. Therefore, military demands for the training of volunteers oscillated most irregularly. Oh, an irregular oscillation. Camp McClellan, largest of Davenport's 5 encampments, had its first birthday on August of 1862. The year-old camp could take pride in its service as a rendezvous training center for the 8th, 11th, 13th, 14th, and 16th regiments of the infantry. By a series of tragic events which occurred during the anniversary month in the northern sister state of Minnesota, fate prepared a strange new role for Camp McClellan. As one perused of the official records, he became cognizant of the serious internal as well as external difficulties which confronted Iowa through the Civil War. Domestically, the draft friction of 1863 and the menace of the pro-Southern Knights of the Golden Circle seemed threatening. From without particular in 1861, there was the likelihood of Missouri raiders, possible Indian violence from across the Minnesota border, never vanished. Recall that the Northern armies fought not only against the 11 seceding states, but often in Indian country as well. That was up in the Midwest. Indian country was huge up there in the Midwest. And if you guys remember, the Great Spirit Lake Massacre, another genocide besides the Civil War. In the New Mexico, Nebraska, Dakota, and Colorado territories, Indians engaged thousands of Northern soldiers in scattered hostilities from 1861 to 1865. So the genocide of the North that the South doesn't want to recognize, and also, well, the Indian country and the Civil War was going on at the same time, most likely. Of all of Iowa's immediate potential dangers, Governor Kirkwood appears to have been concerned most over possible Sioux depredations from the Northwest. The governor's forebodings were not without considerable justification. Fortunately for Iowa, the appalling Sioux uprising of August 1862 was contained in Minnesota, ignited by a handful of blanket Indians. Malcontents that should have remained in a local flare-up was extinguished only after slaughter had swept far up the Red River Valley and south almost to the Iowa border. Only after most severe fighting were troops from Fort Snelling able to defeat Little Crow and his desperate followers, but not until some 400 settlers had been killed. By early September, over 2,000 Indians, the majority women and children, had been rounded up in General Sibley's campaign to restrain any such future massacres. This is another massacre I didn't know about, I never learned about. During early 1863, the United States Congress abrogated all treaties with these Sioux, thereupon leaving them homeless. This only legitimized what was already a fact, for shortly after their capture by Sibley's forces, the Indians had been incarcerated within Fort Snelling and at Mankato, Minnesota. Now, Mankato, Minnesota, if you remember, is there's a story about Laura Ingalls Wilder, Mankato, Minnesota. I mean, it's kind of all in the same area. So intense, however, was the public wrath against the red men that over 300 of them were condemned to be hanged as participants in the August massacres. A portion of those unfortunate people were shipped west to Nebraska Territory. On March 23rd, Davenport's Daily Democrat must have jolted not a few of its readers when it revealed, "There is a prospect that the reprieved Indians, only 38 were finally hanged, at Mankato, Minnesota, are to be transferred to this place. To those, them loose would ensure their speedy death at the hands of the outraged Minnesotans. There are also 200 of the Red Devils chained together in pairs." A month later, 278 of the Sioux Braves, 16 squaws, and 2 papooses were removed from their log stockade in Mankato and transferred to an empty corner of Camp McClellan at Davenport. The 200 by 200-foot pen was labeled Camp Kearney, exactly why it's not clear. Fortunately, the officer in charge, as well as Davenport community, soon realized how abject and docile these fiendish butchering heathens actually were. Iowans came to most favorably impressed by the thrice daily Christian worship services carried on by the Sioux. After a short time, their manacles were removed, and as none attempted to escape, considerable liberty was permitted to them. Camp Kearney's inmates were not long in discovering that there was a local market for their bows and arrows. Soon these Indian-made items, in addition to their mussel shells, rings, and usual hand-wrought jewelry were circulating in Scott County. Some of the Indians were even permitted to earn spending money by laboring on local farms. According to Professor Folwell, a large portion of them asked to be allowed to enlist in the volunteer army, but the Secretary of War decided it would be inexpedient to grant the request. It is not surprising that by December of 1863, the novelty of the Sioux captives had worn off. Earlier in April of that year, a reporter for the Davenport Daily Democrat had described them. A fairer lot of the Indians and physical development it would be difficult to find. They are large, straight, and of resolute mind. No captivity can obliterate the native majesty or dim the fiery, restless eyes of the strong, patriotic savages. But until December, the same newspaper declared, ugh, when at Camp McClellan the other day we visited the Indian pen, and where they have some 365 men, women, and children, real Native Americans. We have read something of Indian romance, but in looking at those specimens, we could not see it. We could see no evidence of nobleness or dignity in the character, but rather evidence of treachery and cruelty. Every one of them proved guilty of murder of one of the white men, should have been hung with the 28 already executed. 1863 had been the year of decision for Northern and Southern armies. Marsh, Lee, and indomitable army were unwilling, however, to accept the omens of Vicksburg and Gettysburg. The Davenport community, which had already provided 5 training rendezvous camps and only recently an Indian prison, was therefore called upon to assist in a new wartime endeavor, a prison center for captured Confederates. As early as February of 1862, Adjutant General Baker of Iowa had written to Senator James W. Grimes about Davenport as a less likely location for prisoners of war camp. 3,000 prisoners, he wrote, can be kept here at 16 cents per day. Government furnishing 16 cents per day. Now think about that with inflation. Now I know it's probably not the most kind thing to think about, but think about the price, 16 cents per day. 3,000 prisoners, he wrote, can be kept here at 16 cents per day in 1862, 16 cents per day. Government furnishings, building, fuel, and guards. No immediate action was taken on this matter. Exactly what site Adjutant General Price had in mind is not now clear. The federally owned island of Rock Island must have been discussed earlier as a possible prison locality. Its ready accessibility by Mississippi River steamboats and the rail link of the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, not to mention its relative isolation by water, recommended it. Now, Rock Island it's kind of like an Alcatraz, only it's not an Alcatraz, but it's in the middle of the Mississippi River. So I mean, Alcatraz is probably deeper than the Mississippi, but it's the Mississippi's still surrounded by water. So it seems to be a common thing where back in that day, the other thing they were doing is building moats around prisons too. Moats where alligators would be around, or the water, it was so deep that the prisoners would have a hard time if they escaped. At the outbreak of the Civil War, neither side was equipped to handle large numbers of prisoners. Before the conflict ended, the Confederacy had incarcerated some 194,743 captured soldiers, while the Union imprisoned approximately 214,825. Due to its belated victories, it was not until 1862 to 1863 that the North began to be confronted with seriously pressing demands for prisoner of war camps. To help meet these needs, the government-owned Rock Island was designated as a military prison in July of 1863. I never knew that. So there we go with the beginning of me learning about military bases being prisons for the Civil War. So the Civil War is actually the blame. The Civil War era is the blame of prisons in the United States. Commissary General of Prisoners William F. Hoffman. So here we go with the Commissary of General again. The Commissary General of Prisoners William H. Hoffman, always a dollar-conscious administrator, ordered that the barracks be put up in the roughest and cheapest manner, mere shanties with no fine work about them. Captain Charles R. Reynolds, assistant. Oh, interesting. Isn't Kim Reynolds the governor of Iowa right now, I believe? Kim Reynolds? Captain Charles R. Reynolds, assistant quartermaster, was assigned the task of constructing the compound. The plans, which he secured from the quartermaster general's office, were, if necessary, to be modified to meet the character of the grounds. And Reynolds is interesting because I think Governor Ray, what was his first name? I don't remember his first name. Governor Ray of Iowa. He was a governor for a long, long time until they put in term limits. What in the world was his name? I've got to look up his name right fast here. Governor Ray of Iowa, the former governor. Everybody liked him and kept voting for him as though let's see what his name was. Iowa, Governor Ray, Iowa. What was his name? Robert Ray was from Iowa. And he was a governor forever and ever and ever. Okay. And so the plans which he secured from the quartermaster general's office were, if necessary, to be modified to meet the character of the ground. Tree covered and largely free of swampland, the 3 mile long island soon rang with the sounds of hammers, shovels, and saws. Now, typically, a lot of people don't think of, I know I didn't as a kid growing up in the Midwest near rivers and streams, and I didn't think of it as being swampland, but technically it is. The Mississippi River is a huge swampland, and it's dividing the United States in half, and when it floods, it creates a whole new ocean, splitting the United States in half. If we didn't have the bridges, it would be impossible to cross the Mississippi River, because if we read the books from the pioneer days, that's one of the problems they had with their wagons, was crossing the Mississippi River during the springtime when it's flooding. By late November of 1863, the Army felt that the Rock Island prison was prepared to begin receiving its motley charges. The camp, laid out in a square, consisted of 84 wooden barracks, 6 rows of 14 each. Auxiliary structures were provided outside of the compound proper for guard troops and supplies, and etc. The streets were 100 feet wide, and the distance between each of the barracks was 40 feet. Each building was 1 story, raised 3 feet from the ground, and stood 12 feet high. That sounds like the old World War II barracks that the military had. 120 men slept in the barracks, 100 by 22 feet. 18 feet was taken up at one end for a cookhouse. Surrounding the 84 dwellings was the prescribed 12-foot fence with a sentinel's walk on the outside 4 feet below the top. Drainage was good. The water supply was adequate. The portable cesspools assured maximum toilet sanitation. Brigadier General William W. Orme noted that natural obstacles to escape are very trivial around this island, and urged that at least 14 full companies of invalid corps be designated to secure the prison. What does that mean, invalid corps? What is an invalid corps? This is a term I have not heard before. And urged that at least 14 full companies of invalid, two different, it's spelled the same, 2 different definitions, so I'm not sure what that means. No, they've got a picture, really, really grainy. I'd have to turn my computer sideways to see it. The first soldiers to be assigned as guards reported on November 2nd, 1863. On December 3rd, 1863, Rock Island Prison received its initial body of ex-Confederate fighting men. They had been captured at the battles of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge by February 1864. There were 7,149 of them, guarded by 1,361 Yankees of the Invalid Corps. Someone needs to tell me, is it invalid like paraplegic or invalid corps? I'm not sure. But it's a really interesting name. In keeping with the international law and regulations of the United States Army, the prisoners were to be issued the same food in quality and quantity as was given to the Union soldiers. The regulation ration was the prisoners were to receive consisted of 3/4 of a pound of bacon, or 1 1/4 pounds of beef, 1 1/3 pounds of white, or 1 1/4 pounds of cornbread, 1/10 pound of green coffee, and 1½ ounces of rice or hominy, 1/6 pound of sugar, a gill of vinegar, 1 star candle, a tablespoon of salt, and beans and potatoes and molasses in reduced amounts. The most immediate need of the men imprisoned for the duration was proper clothing. On their arrival, their uniforms were commonly in tatters, and their blankets often as not were but bundles of rags. The few photographs which exist of the Rock Island inmates make it appear that they, like so many other captured Confederates, were provided with rejected gray Northern state uniforms. Early in the conflict, these state uniforms, made of good material, had been replaced by the Union blue. Ironically, Johnny Reb was thereby provided with a fine new Confederate uniform as he entered the stockade hundreds of miles from Dixieland. The Rock Island prison had been in operation for hardly more than a month when the two river towns which flanked it began to stir uneasily. Dame rumor had begun to cause raised eyebrows in Davenport and the Illinois counterpart, Rock Island, over the shockingly high number of deaths out of the island. Alarmed at these tales, the slow wheels of bureaucratic investigation began to turn. On January 18, 1864, a medical inspector reported that suffering among the prisoners was for the most part untrue or greatly exaggerated. However, the grim fact remains that for the period from January through May of 1864, the Rock Island prison had the highest number of deaths of any Union prison then in operation. A perusal of the official records strongly indicates that neither criminal negligence nor filthy living conditions brought on the tragedy. The number of excessive deaths seemed to have resulted from two major factors: the introduction of virulent smallpox by infected prisoners during the camp's first month of existence, and the failure of the camp administration to act quickly to meet the threat. The fact should not be overlooked. The fact should not be overlooked that the 1968 Southern fighting men who eventually died at Rock, that should be 1868, I think, but that might be a typo. The 1868 Southern fighting men who eventually died at Rock Island Prison never equaled the death totals which were unhappily reached at such larger Union prisons as Camp Chase, Ohio, and Point Lookout, Maryland. Certainly, the living accommodations at Rock Island Prison were as different from the squalid Andersonville prison as day and night. There is some evidence of negligence in medical preparation at the Rock Island prison. However, it only tends to indicate that no one in authority had visualized the likelihood of smallpox epidemic in the prisons. As late as a few weeks before the island accepted its first charges, no medical officer had been appointed. Further, by mid-January of 1864, medical supplies were still inadequate. During these first months, hundreds of prisoners of war were being interned on the island. Camp facilities were being improved, but no real sense of urgency in the face of the smallpox outbreak is evident. The official records do not tell us at all what we would like to know. It seems inescapably clear, however, that lethargy evaporated with the arrival during the first weeks of February of Dr. A.M. Clark, acting medical inspector of the prisoners of war. Clark was unafraid to label incompetency to take upon his own shoulders as a responsibility for building a genuine isolation hospital. Clark praised the prison camp acting surgeon, who, also inexperienced, was trying to do well with assistants, who, with one of the two exceptions, are utterly inefficient. The medical inspector was glad to find smallpox vaccination finally being employed, but pointed an accusing finger at the Louisville, Kentucky officers who had originally forwarded the disease captives, some even who had broken out. The following month, the outspoken Dr. Clark was satisfied to report that all those who suffered from smallpox were now properly isolated. So they were quarantining them is what they were doing, kind of like during COVID. So as before, he did not hesitate to label inefficiency, this time an Iowa volunteer body, for their unmilitary performance. He also observed that the proximity of the cemetery was unhealthy, and he directed that it be moved. Inspector Clark apparently was able to get along well enough with the prison commander, Colonel A.J. Johnson, once the proportions of smallpox curse began to be felt. The camp commander was probably grateful for the outspoken physician. In early March, Commander Johnson was notified by halt work on the prison hospital. Colonel Hoffman, Commissary General of Prisoners, after consulting with the Secretary of War, had issued the orders erroneously, believing that the prisoner's sickness was of a temporary character. A March report from William Watson, volunteer surgeon, to Charles S. Tripler, Army Medical Director, brushed away with any foggy notion about health conditions at a 4-month-old prison. Tripler. Isn't there a Tripler hospital? I'm not sure. I found the morning report of sick in quarters 350 and hospital 715, of whom 420 were in the Variola Hospital. I found a great want of cleanliness among the patients and attendants, which is disappearing under stringent regulations. The impression seemed to prevail that it was injurious to wash, which resulted in an accumulation of filth. Watson also enclosed a written copy of a report that he had made to the prison's commander, Colonel A.J. Johnson. If more evidence of the urgent necessity of new buildings was requisite, it could be found in the startling ratio of the late weekly and monthly reports. 104.66 was the ratio of deaths per 1,000 for the week ending March 5th, and 330 deaths among 1,664 cases treated for the month ending February 9th. A few days later, orders were issued to Colonel Johnson from his economy-minded superior, Colonel Hoffman, to go ahead and finish the needed hospital facilities. Actually, the backbone of the smallpox threat had been broken in February of 1864. In that month, death had reaped a pathetic harvest of 346 men among the 7,600 then incarcerated. Think about that. 7,600 had been incarcerated. Unquestionably, the bitterly cold January of 1864 had helped to weaken men already suffering from smallpox and such secondary ills as diarrhea, dysentery, and pneumonia. Recall also that the captured Confederates continued to arrive at Rock Island from St. Louis, Louisville, dirty and weak prime targets for camp contagions. Nevertheless, by October of 1864, the prison abstract reported only 52 deaths out of the current prison body of 8,181 men. As may be deduced, a stringent policing of body, barracks, and grounds, plus an increasing effective medical program, had won the prison health battle. Outside from their daily roll calls and the cleaning of their quarters, the duties of the prison population were few. Visitors were rarely allowed. Outside, censored mail, however, was permitted the men. Camp Commander Johnson was on alert to slow agony of boredom which gnawed on each of his charges. Although not required to labor about the camp, the men were provided with an opportunity to earn 5 to 10 cents per day, depending on their skill. This income they quickly exhausted with the purchase of such items as pies, candies, bologna, stamps, and surprisingly enough pens, knives from the camp sutler. So they could buy knives in this prison? That is so strange. They would allow them to buy knives. With the knives, the more enterprising Southerners carved rings, breastpins, and miscellaneous trinkets. The sale of these handicrafts enlarged their diminutive purchasing power. One cannot help. They were doing arts and crafts in prison? One cannot help but speculate if their knickknacks were ever undersold by the redskin merchandise from across the river at Camp Kearney. One of the projects chosen by Colonel Johnson to improve the prison compound and keep many inmates occupied was a major expansion of the camp's sewer system. The resolute blasting and digging evidently inspired more ambitious of the prisoners to go into business for themselves. On the night of June 14, 1864, 10 of them made their escape by tunneling from a barracks directly under the parapet. That's an interesting name, parapet. I don't know what a parapet is, but that must be an old terminology. Just as the last two were emerging, they had hailed by the sentry, who immediately gave alarm. 3 were soon taken on the island, and 4 were captured near Rock River, 4 miles distance. 1 was drowned attempting to cross the slough, and 2 apparently gained their freedom. Behind the 12-foot fence surrounding the Rock Island prison, a ditch had been dug along the ridge, and set a few yards back from it stood a row of stakes. This line of stakes was called the dead line, and meant exactly that for any prisoner who risked crossing it. The 23rd of September must have been a bad day for the soldiers from the land of cotton, for on that day a new body of soldier guards arrived at the 108th Regiment of Colored Infantry. 1 month later, a Private Cowers of that unit walked his guard. He noticed a shadowy figure slipping across a ditch. Then, when I got close enough, crept right up to him and fired at him while he was scratching under the fence. Yet, despite the easy prospect of meeting a deadly lead ball, 41 Johnnies succeeded to gamble for their freedom and home. Possibly this tenacity may have had something to do with the strange request of the usually parsimonious Colonel Hoffman. On August 4th, 1864, he ordered a barge to be purchased and fitted up for the accommodation of a guard of 35 men armed with a 6-pound field piece and a 24-pound howitzer to be anchored in the Mississippi River off Rock Island as additional security. The Commissary General of Prisoners' caution was never put to the test. Once the sands began to run out of the Confederacy of 1864, they did so with increasing momentum. During the later part of that year, public pressure in both the North and the South secured a program of sick and invalid prisoner exchange. Oh, invalid. Okay, so they became invalids because they were sick. A program of sick and invalid prisoner exchange. Invalid. Okay, so I kind of forget about that word usage of invalid. We did used to use that at one time. People were called an invalid because they were, I was thinking invalid, but it's invalid as in disabled or traumatic brain injured, so there's all kinds of terminology now. A complication arose over what to do with the Southern prisoners who did not wish to be sent south. Many prisoners, particularly those from the border states, preferred to take the oath of allegiance in accordance with the terms of Lincoln Amnesty Proclamation. On January 16, 1865, Colonel Johnson reported that 281 prisoners left for exchange via Cairo, Illinois. Oh, what an interesting name there, Cairo, Illinois. Kind of like Cairo, Egypt, but Cairo, Illinois. Although only 23 accepted the privilege of taking the oath, he could rejoice that nearly all alleging that as soon as they were exchanged would desert and go home. The following month, however, some 1,330 of the camp's inmates refused to be sent in exchange. In the official records, there was a letter to Jefferson Davis from 5 of the camp's zealous Southerners who opposed this and who did their best to reenlist the backsliders. Hello, Landon Logan. Hello. One can imagine the deep rancor which split the two divergent bodies as the war shuddered to a stop. Do you have anything you'd like to ask? Any questions? Anything, Landon? In the weeks following Appomattox, the activity about Rock Island Prison rapidly receded. In March, there had been 5,000 men languishing in the stockade. A month after the war had ended, approximately 2,664 remained. During July, the last 2 prisoners were released. On the 6th of that month, a military inspector reported that the grounds, barracks, hospital, and records all showed great care and attention on the part of the commanding officer, Colonel Johnson. Throughout its operation, the Rock Island Prison had confined 12,215 prisoners. Among them occurred 1,968 deaths, some 500 perishing from the effects of smallpox. From its days of actual existence to this day, the Rock Island Prison has been maligned for harboring poor, starving creatures. The facts do not confirm this indictment. The number of deaths was grievous, and some administrative incompetency did occur. That the men were ravenous and deliberately allowed to die in an old wives' tale. Once the unfortunate health circumstances were recognized for the peril which they genuinely held, great exertions were made to overcome them. Belated through these efforts may have been, the official records attest to their efficiency once they were applied. Efficacy is the word. Their efficacy, not efficiency, efficacy. Just as Lee surrendered, concluded the prison roll to the government's island, so did the signal to eclipse of the Davenport military post. Indeed, the Camp McClellan Hospital have proved more useful during the closing month of the war than it had its empty training facilities. The summer of 1865 saw these camps assisting with the General Army demobilization, most particularly the paying and discharging of the Hawkeye veterans of Scott County, Iowa. From this day, of which Davenport was the most important population center, 4,117 men had gone forth to serve their nation. Of this number, 222 had died in battle in the southern prisons. County historian Harry E. Downer later asserted that Scott County men were in every regiment which Iowa sent to the front. Camp Kinsman, second in size to Camp McClellan, was only one of the 5 Davenport training encampments to be retained for peacetime employment. It was particularly rebuilt and emerged as an orphan's home. The others were razed and their lumber sold. So I guess their history must have been destroyed too. What about Redmond? Unwanted, utterly incongruous in their Davenport setting, their lot would have surrendered have been a life absent of hope except for their faithful friend and spiritual guide, Dr. Williamson of the Methodist Church. In 1864, at his urging, some 40 were pardoned, and in 1866 the remaining 247 were pardoned by President Johnson. Almost a year after the termination of the national conflict, the Red Devils were loaded on a steamboat and removed to Fort Randall, Dakota Territory, and final reunion with their fellows. The role of the Davenport community in the Civil War was important. It fused strong strands of wartime strength for the Northern War effort. Clearly, the totality of America's great North-South upheaval could not have existed but for the vast interdependent war efforts undertaken by such areas as this Mississippi River community. Reduction of postage. One of the questions now agitated, which will be brought forth before Congress as its present session, is the enormous tax now paid in postage upon letters. Mr. Wycliffe, Postmaster General, recommends a reduction of postage to 10 and 5 cents, provided the department be left to lean upon its own resources. There is no question that calls louder upon Congress for this action than of the reduction of postage. So, back here in 1863, during the Civil War, they're talking about inflation back then, too. That's what it sounds like to me. So, they're asking for a cheaper price in postage so they can afford to do things. So, this country has a terrible, terrible time with inflation and the private sector and capitalism. There is no question that calls louder upon Congress for action than that of the reduction of postage. It is an unjust and unnecessary taxation. That's true, it is a tax. Oh, what a clever way to think of postage stamps as a tax. Oh my goodness. It is. It is a tax. And Congress is always bragging that post office can stand on its own. It doesn't need any help. It's a private organization. Well, it's ran by Congress. But it can actually function on its own without Congress. So it has been proved by the soundest logic that the increase of course I find that fascinating too that they use the word of postage stamps as a tax for communication. So let's think of our internet phone service as a tax for communication. We really could think of our internet service as a tax for communication. So if we think of our internet service, such as our phones, now you can buy a ham radio. You don't get taxed on that communication. But for hooking up to the phones, the more popular way, other than ham radios, you get a tax for the phone service. And so, yet the ham radios, at one time they said they had to have a license or something to operate them. I don't know if they do anymore or not. But that would be considered a tax. And so, okay, so if we're going to call the post office a tax on an unnecessary tax, then we can call phone service an unnecessary tax as well. I think we should go that direction and call our phones an unnecessary tax and look at the inflation with that. And back during the Civil War, after the war, they were asking, so the war actually caused stamps to go up higher. So postage was 10 cents and they wanted to remove it down to 5 cents. And so it's been proof that the sound logic that the increase of correspondence resulting from a reduction of postage will counterbalance the decrease of revenue so that this department will not have to depend on the government for support. Bloomington Herald, January 3rd, 1845. And so basically the war, what it did was stimulated the economy for the post office and for a few other things at the expense of the life of young men. That's what it did. And so I think that's it here. Let's see here. Copyright of the Annals of Iowa is the property of the state of Iowa and by the State Historical Society of Iowa, and its content may not be copied or emailed to multiple sites or posted to a listserv without the copyright holder's express written permission. However, users may print, download, or email articles for individual use. And so that's what it says. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. There's nothing on here that says how to get it hold of anybody to begin with anyway. And it's old. I mean, was this written back in the 1800s and is this person now deceased? I have no idea. Let's see. I cited who. Let's see here. 1958. So, anyway, that's it for right now. I think that's all I have on that one. I'll come up with something else a little bit later. We've been on here for an hour, and I think that's about it.